per Bloomberg, Apple is considering bringing more licensed content from other studios to its streaming services, right? So for context, Nielsen reports that Apple TV Plus, their streaming service, which is different than Apple TV, right? Because that's just, a way where you can rent and buy movies, but Apple TV Plus is like the monthly subscription service. Nielsen reports that Apple TV Plus, has about less than 1% of total TV viewership, right? And that's not necessary, and that makes sense because they don't have a lot of original content, right? But I have not actually watched a lot of Apple TV Plus original content, but from my understanding, it is very, very good. So you can see a picture here of the show Severance. From my understanding, people are comparing it to like the early days of HBO, where like there'll just be one show on for a season for like 8 or 10 weeks, and then a new show will start. Like, it's not like you have like 12 things going on all at once. So it's this idea of quality over quantity. But as we know with streaming services, quantity, you both matter. You need quality, but you also really need quantity, right? That still matters. So a big thing with Apple TV Plus, the streaming service, is that there's not a bunch of other studios' content, right? As opposed to like when you go on Netflix, like, you can watch, maybe not anymore, but like, famously you could watch The Office, or you could watch Friends, or Breaking Bad. These were not Netflix shows, but they licensed them, right? Apple TV Plus doesn't really have a library like that, right? And notably compared to their peers, IndieWire notes that other services that are manned by non-studios, so we're not talking about Disney Plus or Max or Peacock, but we're talking about like Netflix and Amazon, they have bolstered their libraries in other ways, right? So Amazon bought MGM, right? Which is obviously now it's like, okay, now we can put all that on there. And then Amazon also, like Netflix, licensed other iconic shows, right? To help build out the library. So this report from Bloomberg illustrates a shift in strategy, right? I've always felt, like you can make Apple TV Plus a place to get non-Apple. You have to make this a place to get non-Apple content, right? You can't just have these little silos. It helps that Apple TV Plus, at least for the time being, is like one of the cheapest, not the cheapest. It's only like $5 a month or something. Really, really affordable. But probably if you did a cost breakdown, the amount of content you're getting for it is probably actually more expensive than something like Netflix in a way. So the question here is that they're already shifting the strategy. Will they follow suit with like an Amazon? Could they buy an iconic studio, right? That has like a decades, if not a century, of content, right, to pull from. Frankly, well, not frankly, because the whole thing is clusterfuck. But in some ways, I'm almost, because of this, this report, I'm almost surprised they didn't put their hat in to bid on Paramount, right? Because that would be, that's a long storied studio that, again, has been around for about a century. It has all this content from both Paramount proper and then all of the, acquisitions. So like CBS and like MTV and Nickelodeon and Comedy Central, and all of those assets could really help Apple TV in that regard. But ultimately, they probably won't buy a studio like Paramount or buy any studio. It's probably just going to come down to getting more licensed content, right? Which I've always said is the way this, it was the streaming industry worked really well. Well, for a few reasons. One, because the bubble hadn't burst, because people kept looking at growth as opposed to profit, number one. Number two, there weren't many players. But thirdly, and I think this is most importantly, there was a balance in the sense that you had Netflix, which did make some original content, but for it really building up into a success enough to be able to make its content, it had to license everything. So it benefited Netflix because they got the content, and it benefited the studios because they got basically passive income on these properties, right? It was when the studios got greedy and went, we want our own streaming service. And it's really dumb. So we have Jason Kilar, who's the former CEO of Warner Media before it was then spun off to Warner, to make Warner Brothers Discovery. He recently talked about that he believes the future of streaming services of like film and TV is going to be a lot more like Spotify and Apple Music, right? Because ultimately those two services, as well as other ones like Amazon Music or Google or like all the different platforms, they all have the same libraries, right? There's not really much original content, and when something doesn't have it, it's because of like, something like the big Spotify, situation where people were pulling their music off because of Joe Rogan, right? So the competition between these companies is more based on price and the quality of service, right? And again, it's better for the industry when there's a divide between production, distribution, and exhibition, right? So, I think the future of streaming is going to be more like Jason Keelar says, more like Spotify and Apple Music, where the studios are licensing their content to most, if not all, of these third-party services. And what people decide to do, which one they decide to go with, will be based on other factors, not necessarily if you have the content, right? Because again, think about it like this. Like the analogy would be like if in the music sphere you had a streaming service just for Warner Music, and then you had a streaming service just for Sony Music, and then that seems really strange, right? To our understanding, because we have things like Spotify and Apple Music that just has everything. And notably, people can self-upload, right? Or publish, right? So I think I agree with Jason Keelar. I think that's going to be the future, and Amazon and Apple seem the best poised to become hubs for other streaming services, right? In that, in addition to having their streaming services, you can also buy and rent movies and TV shows. So I think it's the natural next step to not only be able to buy and rent movies on these services, and then also have a monthly subscription service, but then also having the option to use your Hulu account, use your Peacock account or your Max through Amazon, through Apple, through their interface, so that you can have everything in one place. I think that's going to be the future. It's just a matter of when will the studios wise up, not if.